Forgiveness is one of the most powerful and life-changing decisions we can ever make, yet for so many, it remains one of the hardest things to do. When we are hurt, betrayed, or wronged, our natural instinct is to hold on to that pain, to demand justice, or to wait for an apology that may never come. But true forgiveness isn't about excusing the offense or pretending the pain never happened. It isn't about saying that what was done to us was okay. No, forgiveness is something far deeper. It is a choice, a release, a surrendering of the burden that has been weighing on our hearts. It is an act of trust, a step of faith, a decision that sets us free. Many people misunderstand what forgiveness really is. Some believe that forgiving means forgetting, as if we should erase the memory of what happened. Others think that forgiveness means allowing someone to hurt us again, that it means being weak or giving up justice. But that's not what forgiveness is at all. Forgiveness does not mean pretending that the wound never existed. It does not mean allowing someone to continue harming us. It does not mean that there are no consequences for wrongdoing. What forgiveness means is that we make a conscious choice to release the anger, the bitterness, the resentment that holds us captive. It means we stop carrying the heavy weight of unforgiveness and allow God to be the one who handles justice. If we look at the life of Jesus, we see the ultimate example of forgiveness. As he hung on the cross, suffering the worst kind of pain and rejection, he did not curse those who crucified him. He did not demand revenge. Instead, he looked down at the very people who mocked him, who drove the nails into his hands, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." That kind of forgiveness is beyond human strength. It is divine, and yet Jesus calls us to follow his example. Maybe someone has wronged you deeply. Maybe you've been hurt in a way that feels impossible to move past. Maybe the pain of what happened still lingers in your heart, and you struggle with the thought of letting it go. But let me ask you this. Who is really suffering because of your unforgiveness? The truth is, holding on to bitterness does not hurt the other person nearly as much as it hurts you. Unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to be harmed by it. It builds walls around your heart, keeping you trapped in the past, preventing you from moving forward into the freedom God has for you. Think about the story of Joseph in the Bible. He was betrayed by his own brothers, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. If anyone had a right to hold on to anger and resentment, it was Joseph. But when he finally stood face to face with the very people who had hurt him, he did not seek revenge. He did not let bitterness define him. Instead, he forgave them. He saw that God had used even the pain, even the suffering, to bring about a greater purpose. And in that forgiveness, Joseph found freedom. Some of us are waiting for an apology before we forgive. We think if they just admit they were wrong, then I can let this go. But what if that apology never comes? What if the person who hurt you never acknowledges what they did? Does that mean you have to live the rest of your life carrying that burden? No. Forgiveness is not for them. It is for you. It is a gift you give yourself. It is a decision that allows you to step into the peace and healing that God has for you. Maybe you're thinking, but I just don't feel like forgiving. That's understandable. Forgiveness is not about feelings. It's about faith. If we waited until we felt like forgiving, we might never do it. But when we choose to forgive, even before emotions catch up, something powerful happens. God begins to work in our hearts. He softens the pain. He brings healing where there was once only hurt. He gives us the strength to do what we could never do on our own. And if you're struggling to forgive, you don't have to do it alone. You can bring it to God. You can say, "Lord, I don't know how to forgive, but I know you have called me to. Help me. Change my heart. Give me the strength to release this pain into your hands." And he will help you. Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness. It is one of the greatest acts of strength. It is not something that makes you a victim. It is something that sets you free. And when you choose to forgive, you are walking in the power and love of God, releasing yourself from the chains of the past and stepping into the peace that only He can give. Forgiveness is not just something we do because it feels right or because it makes life easier. It is something God calls us to do. It is not an option, not a suggestion, but a command. And He calls us to forgive not only because it brings healing to our hearts, but because it reflects His very nature. The Bible is clear. Our God is a God of mercy. He is a God of grace. He is a God who does not hold our sins against us, but instead offers forgiveness freely through Jesus Christ. And if we have received that forgiveness, how can we withhold it from others? Jesus Himself said in Matthew 6:14-15, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins." That is a powerful statement. It means that the way we forgive others is directly tied to the forgiveness we receive from God. Some may say, "But you don't understand what they did to me. You don't know the depth of my pain." And that is true. Only God fully understands the wounds we carry. But He does not ask us to forgive because the other person deserves it. He asks us to forgive because He has already forgiven us. None of us are without sin. We have all fallen short of His glory. We have all made mistakes, hurt others, and turned away from God at times. Yet He continues to love us. He continues to extend His mercy. He continues to invite us into His grace. One of the most powerful stories Jesus ever told about forgiveness is found in Matthew 18, the parable of the unmerciful servant. A man owed a great debt to a king, so large that he could never repay it. But instead of punishing the man, the king had compassion and forgave the entire debt. That man, however, went out and found another who owed him a small amount of money. And rather than showing the same mercy, he demanded full repayment and had the man thrown into prison. When the king heard what happened, he was furious. He said, "I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" The man was then punished for his lack of mercy. What a sobering reminder. We have been forgiven a debt we could never repay. The price of our sin was too great, but Jesus took it upon Himself at the cross. And now He calls us to reflect that same forgiveness in our own lives. If we truly understand what He has done for us, we will not hold on to bitterness and resentment. We will not withhold mercy from those who have wronged us. We will choose to forgive because we have been forgiven. But still, some may say it's too hard. I don't have the strength to forgive. And the truth is, on our own, we don't. But God never asks us to do it alone. When we take that step of obedience, when we say, "Lord, I don't know how to forgive, but I am willing to try," He steps in. He gives us the grace we need. He softens our hearts. He removes the burden of anger and pain. Forgiveness is not just about the past. It is about the future. When we refuse to forgive, we keep ourselves trapped in a prison of bitterness. We replay the hurt over and over again. We let it define our lives. But when we forgive, we step into freedom. We let go of the chains that hold us back. We make room for peace. God does not ask us to forgive because it is easy. He asks us to forgive because it is necessary. It is necessary for our relationship with Him, necessary for our healing, necessary for the abundant life He wants us to live. And when we trust Him, when we obey His word, when we surrender our hurts to Him, we find that forgiveness is not just something we give to others, it is a gift He gives to us. Bitterness and resentment are like chains that bind the heart, keeping us locked in a prison of pain. Many people live their entire lives carrying the weight of past offenses, unable to move forward because of the wounds that others have inflicted upon them. They replay the hurt over and over in their minds, allowing anger to take root deep within their souls. But God never intended for us to live that way. He calls us to something greater. He calls us to freedom. Holding on to bitterness does not hurt the person who wronged us nearly as much as it hurts us. It poisons our thoughts, it steals our joy, and it robs us of the peace that God desires for our lives. It is like a heavy burden that weighs us down, preventing us from walking in the fullness of His love. And yet so many struggle to let go because they believe that forgiving means excusing the wrong or allowing injustice to go unanswered. But that is not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not saying that what happened was right. It is not ignoring the pain or pretending it did not happen. Forgiveness is making the decision to release the offense into God's hands and trust Him to deal with it in His perfect justice. When we hold on to resentment, we are the ones who suffer. It seeps into every part of our lives, affecting our relationships, our health, and even our connection with God. Have you ever noticed how anger toward one person can spill over into other areas of life? How the pain of the past can make it difficult to trust, to love, to experience joy in the present? That is what bitterness does. It hardens the heart, making it difficult to receive the blessings that God has for us. There is a story in the Bible that illustrates this so well. In the book of Ruth, there is a woman named Naomi. She once had a full life, a husband, 2 sons, and hope for the future, but then tragedy struck. Her husband died, her sons passed away, and she was left feeling abandoned and alone. When she returned to her homeland, she told the people not to call her Naomi anymore, but to call her Mara, which means bitter, because she felt that life had dealt her nothing but sorrow. Her grief had turned into bitterness, and that bitterness had begun to define her. But what Naomi did not see in that moment was that God was still working. He was preparing to bless her through Ruth, to restore her joy and to give her a future beyond what she could imagine. And that is what bitterness does. It blinds us to the blessings that are still ahead. It keeps us focused on what was lost instead of what God is still able to do. Forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door to healing. It does not change what happened, but it changes how we move forward. It allows us to release the pain, to break free from the chains of resentment, and to experience the peace that comes from trusting God with our wounds. Some might say, I want to forgive, but I just don't feel like it, and that is understandable. Forgiveness is not an emotion, it is a choice. If we wait until we feel like forgiving, we may never do it. But when we take that step, even when it feels difficult, God meets us there. He gives us the grace to release the pain, the strength to let go, and the peace that surpasses all understanding. There is no freedom in bitterness. There is no joy in resentment. But when we choose to forgive, we choose life. We choose peace. We choose to step into the fullness of what God has for us. Letting go does not mean that what happened was right, but it does mean that we refuse to let it control us any longer. It means that we trust God enough to say, I will not carry this weight any longer. I will leave it in your hands. And when we do, we find that the burden lifts, the chains fall away, and our hearts are finally free. Some wounds cut so deep that the very thought of forgiveness feels impossible. There are moments in life when the pain is so overwhelming, the betrayal so severe, that even entertaining the idea of letting go seems like an insult to the suffering we have endured. How do you forgive when the scars still ache? How do you release the hurt when the memory keeps playing over and over in your mind? The truth is, on our own we cannot. But through Christ, we find the strength to do what seems humanly impossible. There are times when we struggle with forgiveness because we believe that forgiving means forgetting or excusing the wrong that was done. We fear that if we let go, we are saying that what happened did not matter, that it did not hurt. But forgiveness does not mean pretending that the pain did not exist. It does not mean that justice should not be served or that consequences do not follow actions. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it does release the power that the past holds over us. It is not about the other person. It is about our own hearts, our own peace, and our own relationship with God. One of the most difficult things about forgiveness is that we often feel like it lets the offender off the hook. We hold on to resentment because it gives us a sense of control, a way to make sure that the pain we experience does not go unnoticed. But the reality is, when we refuse to forgive, we are the ones who remain in bondage. The anger, the bitterness, the constant replaying of the wrong, it only poisons our hearts and weighs us down. Jesus understood this better than anyone. As he hung on the cross, suffering for sins he did not commit, facing rejection and cruelty from the very people he came to save, he had every right to demand justice. Yet, instead of anger, he offered mercy. Instead of condemnation, he spoke words of forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. That kind of forgiveness is not human, it is divine, and it is the kind of forgiveness we are called to extend. Maybe someone has wronged you in a way that feels too deep to forgive. Maybe you've been betrayed by someone you trusted, abandoned by someone you loved, or wounded by words that cut straight to the soul. Maybe you are holding on to pain that has shaped the way you see the world, the way you see people, and even the way you see God. But hear this, unforgiveness does not protect you. It does not make you stronger. It does not heal the hurt. The only thing that truly heals is surrendering that pain to God and allowing Him to take it from your hands. Forgiving does not mean that you have to trust that person again. It does not mean that you have to invite them back into your life. It does not mean that what they did was okay. But it does mean that you are choosing to be free. It means that you are refusing to let the enemy use that pain to control your thoughts, your emotions, and your future. It means that you are trusting God to be the one who brings justice in His way and in His time. Forgiveness is not about fairness. It is not about justice. It is not about who is right and who is wrong. It is about letting go so that your heart can be free. It is about choosing peace over pain, mercy over bitterness, and faith over fear. And when we forgive, when we release that burden into God's hands, we find that the weight lifts. We find that our hearts are lighter. We find that what once felt impossible is now possible through the power of Christ in us. You may not feel ready to forgive today. You may not even know where to begin, but you can take the first step by simply asking God for help. You can say, Lord, I don't know how to do this, but I trust you. Help me to release this pain. Help me to let go of this burden. Help me to walk in the freedom that only you can give, and He will, because He has already given you the greatest gift of forgiveness. And now He is calling you to extend that same grace to others, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. Forgiveness does not always come easily. In fact, it is often one of the hardest things we are called to do. When someone wrongs us, our natural response is to hold on to the pain, to seek justice, or even to desire revenge. We tell ourselves that if we let go, if we forgive, we are allowing them to get away with it. But the truth is, forgiveness is not about letting the other person go free. It is about setting ourselves free. It is about refusing to let the pain of the past dictate our future. And the only way to truly do that is by leaning on God, by relying on His strength, and by allowing Him to work in our hearts. There are times when we may try to forgive on our own, but the hurt is too deep. We may say the words, but inside the resentment still lingers. That is because true forgiveness is not something we can manufacture on our own. It is something that comes from God. It is an act of surrender. It is saying, Lord, I don't know how to let this go, but I trust you to help me. And when we do that, when we open our hearts to His grace, we find that He does what we could never do in our own strength. He softens the hardened places. He brings peace where there was once only turmoil. He heals wounds we thought would never mend. There is a reason that God calls us to forgive. It is not just a suggestion, it is a command. And He commands it because He knows what unforgiveness does to the heart. It traps us in bitterness. It keeps us chained to the past. It robs us of the joy and peace that He desires for our lives. That is why Jesus spoke so often about forgiveness. He knew that without it we cannot truly be free. One of the most powerful reminders of this is found in the Lord's Prayer. Jesus taught His disciples to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors." That means that the way we forgive others is directly connected to how we receive forgiveness from God. If we refuse to forgive, if we hold on to resentment, we are shutting ourselves off from the fullness of His mercy. But when we choose to forgive, when we let go of the hurt, we open the door for His grace to flow freely in our lives. That does not mean it will always be easy. Some hurts are so deep that forgiveness feels impossible. Some betrayals cut so deep that the very thought of letting go seems unfair. But the power to forgive is not something that comes from within ourselves. It comes from God. And He does not ask us to do it alone. He does not expect us to muster up the strength on our own. He simply asks us to be willing to take that first step and to trust Him with the rest. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, when He was suffering in agony, surrounded by people who mocked Him and rejected Him, He had every right to be filled with anger. He had every right to call down judgment on those who had crucified Him. But instead He said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." If He could forgive those who nailed Him to the cross, if He in His perfect righteousness could extend mercy, how can we who have received that mercy withhold it from others? Forgiveness does not mean that we forget what happened. It does not mean that we ignore the pain or that we allow ourselves to be hurt again. It simply means that we place it in God's hands. It means that we trust Him to deal with it, to bring justice in His time and in His way. And when we do that, we find that the weight we have been carrying begins to lift. We find that the anger that once consumed us begins to fade. We find that the peace we have been longing for is finally within reach. Maybe there is someone in your life that you need to forgive. Maybe there is a hurt you have been holding on to for far too long. Maybe you have told yourself that you will never let it go. But today you have a choice. You can continue to carry that burden, or you can release it to God. You can continue to be weighed down by the past, or you can step into the freedom that He offers. The choice is yours. But if you choose forgiveness, if you choose to let go, you will find that God meets you in that place. You will find that His grace is enough. And you will find that the peace you have been searching for has been waiting for you all along. Forgiveness is not just a single act. It is a journey. There are moments when we think we have forgiven only to feel the sting of the past creeping back into our hearts. A memory resurfaces, a wound reopens, and we find ourselves wrestling with the same pain we thought we had released. That is because forgiveness is not about a one-time decision. It is a daily surrender, a continual choice to walk in grace, to release bitterness, and to trust God with our pain. It is a process that requires patience, faith, and a willingness to lean on the strength that only He can provide. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. We hold on to guilt, we replay our mistakes, and we believe the lie that we are unworthy of grace. We think, how could God forgive me after all I've done? But the beautiful truth is that He already has. His forgiveness is not based on our worthiness, it is based on His love. It is not something we have to earn. It is a gift freely given through Christ. When we fail to accept that forgiveness, when we continue to condemn ourselves for what He has already redeemed, we are refusing to walk in the freedom He has offered. And if God Himself has chosen to forgive us, how can we withhold that same forgiveness from ourselves? There is a powerful moment in Scripture when Jesus encounters a woman caught in sin. The crowd is ready to condemn her, to stone her for what she has done. But Jesus, full of mercy, says, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, the accusers drop their stones and walk away. Then Jesus looks at the woman and says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." He does not ignore her sin, but He does not define her by it either. He offers her grace and a new beginning. That is what He offers to each of us. No matter how far we have fallen, no matter what we have done, His grace is greater. His mercy is deeper. And when He forgives, He wipes the slate clean. But that grace is not meant to stop with us. It is meant to flow through us. When we truly understand the depth of God's forgiveness, it transforms the way we forgive others. It humbles us. It reminds us that we are all in need of grace. It takes away our right to hold on to resentment because we know how much we have been forgiven. That is why Jesus said, "Freely you have received, freely give." He knew that when we truly grasp the power of His mercy, we will not want to keep it to ourselves. Forgiveness is not always instant. It takes time. It takes prayer. It takes choosing day after day to surrender the pain to God and trust Him to heal it. There may be moments when old wounds try to resurface, when anger or sorrow try to take hold again. But in those moments, we can remind ourselves of the truth. We are no longer bound by that hurt. We are no longer prisoners to resentment. We have chosen a different path, a path of freedom, a path of grace. And when we continue to walk in that, we find that the pain loses its grip. The chains of bitterness fall away, and the peace of God fills the places that once held only sorrow. Maybe there is someone in your life that you need to forgive. Maybe there is a wound that has held you captive for far too long. Or maybe you are struggling to forgive yourself, to believe that God's grace is enough. Whatever it is, today is the day to lay it down. Today is the day to stop carrying what God has already offered to take from you. The burden is too heavy, the weight is too great, and you were never meant to carry it alone. There is freedom in forgiveness. There is peace in letting go. And when we choose to forgive, when we choose to walk in grace, we are not just releasing others, we are releasing ourselves. So take that step. Trust God with your pain and step into the fullness of the life He has for you.